The chains went still first. That's how Celine knew something was wrong. Not the silence, the stillness. 41 girls on an auction block freezing mid-breath because the alpha king of the Ashvale pack had just lowered his hand toward the one girl no one had bid on. Her. The auction master's voice cracked when he repeated it back. Her, my lord? Like he hadn't heard right. Like the king had pointed at a stain on the floor instead of a person. Fenn didn't repeat himself. He never did. He stood there in a black coat dusted with road salt, a man who'd ridden 2 days to stand in a perfumed hall and choose a single tribute the old way, the way the treaty demanded. One slave, freely chosen, to seal 40 years of peace between 2 packs that had spent 400 trying to kill each other. Behind him, courtiers in furs traded looks they thought were subtle. In front of him, on a riser dressed in nothing but oil and candlelight, stood the kind of women men wrote songs about. Hair like poured wine, skin like a held breath, and at the very end of the line, past all of them, chained to a post because the auction master hadn't thought her worth a riser at all. A girl with a kitchen burn scarring the inside of her left wrist in the shape of a crescent, like the moon had reached down and marked her once and then forgotten her. That was Celine. She weighed maybe 100 pounds in wet wool. Her collarbones stood out like the rims of bowls. She hadn't been fed in 3 days because food was for the girls who might be chosen, and nobody, not the auction master, not the guards, not Celine herself, had believed for 1 single second that anyone would choose her. The king's gray eyes found her like he'd already decided this in another room, another hour. Someplace none of them had been invited into. That one, he said again, in case the silence had eaten his first words. The girl in chains. Somewhere behind Celine, a noblewoman in violet laughed. Short, disbelieving, cut off too fast, like she'd caught herself laughing at a funeral. Celine didn't move. She'd learned a long time ago that moving drew eyes, and eyes were never good. So she stood there with her wrist burn hidden against her hip, and her heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and she thought, with the flat, exhausted clarity of someone who has stopped expecting kindness, he's mistaken me for someone else. He hadn't. 3 days earlier, Celine had been exactly what everyone in that hall still believed her to be. Nothing. A scullery girl in House Marrow's lower kitchens. The kind of servant whose name nobody learns because nobody plans on speaking to her twice. She scrubbed pots until her knuckles split. She slept under a kitchen table on a folded sack because the servants' quarters were full and she was the newest, which in that house meant the least. She had one possession in the world, a ribbon, gray-blue, frayed at both ends, that her mother had tied into her hair the night before the soldiers came and took the rest of her family, for reasons nobody had ever explained to a girl of 9. Celine didn't remember her mother's face anymore. She remembered the ribbon. She remembered hands. When House Marrow's steward came down into the kitchens with a list of names for the tribute auction, a list compiled, Celine would later understand entirely by spite, by every kitchen maid and laundry girl a particular housekeeper had wanted gone. Celine's name was read aloud in a voice that didn't pause for her reaction, the way you'd read out which barrels needed moving. Nobody in that kitchen looked up from their work. That was the wound underneath everything else. Not the chains, not the auction. The simple fact that when her name was called for a fate that might kill her, not one person stopped scrubbing. She went up the stairs that night already grieving, and she hadn't even left yet. The auction hall in Asheville smelled like beeswax and old stone, and, underneath it, faintly, like fear. The particular sour metal smell of 41 bodies that had not been allowed to bathe in days, sweating through silk someone else had chosen for them. Celine stood at the end of a chain of girls and tried to make herself smaller, which was a foolish instinct, because smaller was exactly what had gotten her here. Smaller was invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible had also, apparently, been a lie her whole short life. The auction master worked the floor like he was selling horses. He had a voice built for it. Big, rolling, made to fill a room, and he used it on every girl but her, walking past Celine the way you'd walk past a cracked vase nobody intended to buy. "Lower your eyes, girl," he muttered at her once, not even looking, just a habit. A thing you said to chained women so they didn't forget what they were. She lowered her eyes. That was the position she was in. Head down, wrist burn hidden. Half a strand of gray-blue ribbon still knotted somewhere behind her ear because no one had thought to take it from a girl no one was bidding on. When the doors at the end of the hall opened and the temperature of the room changed. She didn't see him come in. She felt it. Every wolf in that hall felt it, the way you feel weather before you see the sky. A pressure drop, a held breath traveling room to room. The Alpha King of Asheville didn't need a herald. His wolf walked half a step behind his skin everywhere he went. And lesser wolves' instincts simply knew to make room. Celine was not a wolf. She had no instinct telling her to make room. She only had the small animal certainty that something dangerous had entered. And the trained reflex of 7 years in service. "Don't look up." She looked up anyway, just once. Just enough to see him cross the floor. Tall in a way that wasn't about height, so much as the sense that the air rearranged itself around him, dark hair pushed back like he hadn't had a free hand to fix it in days, and along his jaw, just below his left ear, a thin, pale scar shaped like a fishhook. The kind of mark that says, someone got close enough to try. That was Fenn's detail. The one mark on him that wasn't armor or authority. A scar he'd never explained to anyone, not even the men who'd march into a burning building for him. He didn't look at the riser of beautiful women first. He looked at the whole line, the way a man reads a room before he reads a face, and something in his expression went still and unreadable as he reached the end of it. Where Celine stood. "My lord," the auction master's voice had a smile stitched into it, the kind that doesn't reach a person's eyes. "Forgive me. The tribute selections are here." He gestured, sweeping toward the riser, toward wine-dark hair and unbroken skin, and women who had been fed, oiled, dressed, prepared, because some Saswan had decided dead weeks ago that they were the ones worth preparing. Fenn's eyes didn't move toward them, not once. "I saw the selections," he said. "I want her." The hall didn't gasp. It was too well bred to gasp. Instead, it did something worse. It went quiet. A quiet with edges, a quiet you could have cut your hand on. Celine heard the violet-dressed noblewoman's breath catch behind her. She heard a man somewhere mutter a word that might have been insult and might have been mistake. She felt every eye in the room land on her at once, after 7 years of nobody's eyes landing on her at all, and it was so much worse than invisibility that her knees nearly gave. "My lord," the auction master tried again, gentler now, the way you'd correct a child. "Perhaps you misheard the order. She is." He paused, visibly hunting for a way to say, "worthless," that wouldn't sound like he was insulting the king's judgment. "She is kitchen staff, unfed, unwashed. There are far more, suitable." "I heard the order," Fenn said. "I gave it twice." His eyes finally found hers across the hall, gray as riverstone, and Celine, starved, chained, marked by a burn she hid out of habit more than shame, felt the full weight of being seen for the first time in longer than she could remember, and it terrified her more than being overlooked ever had. "Why?" she heard herself say. Not loud, barely a whisper. But the hall was so quiet it carried. Fenn's mouth didn't quite smile. "That's between my wolf and me." They unchained her in front of everyone. That was its own small cruelty, though Celine understood later it wasn't meant as one. The auction required it. The iron had to come off in view of witnesses, so no one could claim later that the king had been tricked into his choice, that some other girl had been substituted in shadow. Her wrists came free and the blood rushed back into her hands, so fast it hurt. A pins and needles burns worse than the iron had been, and she hissed through her teeth before she could stop herself. Fenn was close enough to hear it. He didn't reach for her. That mattered more than she expected, that he stood a clean 3 feet away while the chains dropped, hands loose at his sides, not claiming, not touching, just watching, like he was giving her exactly as much room as she needed and not 1 inch less. "You can walk?" he asked, quiet enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. Yes, a lie. Her legs were shaking. He looked at her for a second longer than was comfortable, like he knew it was a lie and had decided for now to let her keep it. Behind them, the auction master was already moving to smooth the moment over, calling for the next presentation, the next girl, his big rolling voice papering over the silence, like nothing strange had happened at all. But strange had happened. 40 courtiers and 2 packs worth of nobility had just watched the Alpha King of Ashvale choose a starving scullery girl over the most desired women in the province, and not one of them, not the violet-dressed noblewoman, not the lords murmuring behind raised hands, not Celine herself, understood why. She walked out of that hall on legs that barely held, with a king half a step behind her who had said nothing further, and the only thought clear enough to hold on to was the one that would not leave her alone for days. He's going to realize his mistake. And then what happens to me? The talk started before she'd even reached the carriage. Celine heard it the way you hear weather moving in. Not words yet, just texture, a rustle of voices behind raised hands that hadn't learned to lower themselves just because she might be listening now. She kept her eyes on the floor out of 7 years of habit, and that, too, became something people whispered about. See how she keeps her head down. Even now, even chosen, as if her humility were a performance instead of the only language her body knew. The carriage ride back to Ashvale took 2 days, and Fen did not speak to her once. He rode alongside it on horseback most of the time, a king who apparently preferred wind and saddle leather to the comfort of his own carriage. And on the rare hour he sat across from her inside it, he occupied himself with papers, with maps, with anything that wasn't her face. Celine told herself this was relief. Mostly, it felt like waiting for a verdict that hadn't come yet. She ate, on that journey, more food than she'd been given in the previous month combined. Bread that wasn't stale, a wedge of hard cheese, a strip of dried meat that she chewed slowly because her stomach had forgotten how to take anything in quantity. She didn't trust it. Food given freely had a way, in her experience, of turning out to have a price attached, discovered only after you'd already swallowed. On the second night, at a roadside inn that smelled of wood smoke and wet horse, she caught her own reflection in a water basin and almost didn't recognize the girl looking back. Cheekbones too sharp, eyes wide, and just visible at her hairline, the frayed gray-blue ribbon she'd kept through 7 years of service and 1 auction block. She heard Fen's voice through the thin wall before she heard the knock. He was speaking to someone, his second. She'd learn later, a broad-shouldered man named Auric, with a notch missing from his left ear where some old fight had taken a clean bite out of the cartilage. And though Celine couldn't make out every word, she caught enough. "Explain it to the court, my lord. You'll have to give them something." "I don't owe them an explanation." "They'll make one up if you don't give them the truth. You know how this goes." Silence. Then, a long one. Celine sat very still on the other side of that wall, ribbon damp between her fingers, and understood with a cold drop in her stomach that whatever reason the king had for choosing her, he wasn't planning to share it. Not with his own second, not with the court, and certainly not with her. That silence would cost her. She just didn't know yet how much. Asheville's keep rose out of gray stone on a cliff over black water, and Celine's first sight of it, torches lit along ramparts, the howl of some unseen wolf carrying across the cold, was the kind of image she would have called beautiful if she'd had any room left in her for beauty instead of fear. She was given a room. Not quarters. A room. With a bed, and a wash basin, and a window that locked from the inside instead of the outside. And she stood in the doorway of it for a full minute before she let herself believe it was actually hers. It was the staff who made it clear, within the first hour, that none of this would be simple. A woman named Hesta ran the keep's household, broad through the shoulders. Gray-streaked hair scraped back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, and a voice that could strip paint. And she looked Celine up and down in the doorway of that room like she was assessing livestock. "So you're her," Hesta said. "The kitchen rat the king hauled home instead of a proper tribute." Celine said nothing. 7 years of practice told her silence was safer than defense. "Don't get comfortable," Hesta went on, not unkindly exactly, more like a woman delivering a weather report. "Whatever made him point at you, it won't last. Men like him don't keep things that don't make sense to keep. You'll be back scrubbing pots inside a season. Mark me." It was the kind of thing that should have hurt. Mostly, it landed like confirmation of something Celine already suspected. That this was a mistake, with a clock running on it, and the only sensible thing to do was brace for the moment it corrected itself. She didn't brace alone for long. By the second day, 3 different noble families had sent envoys to pay respects to the king's chosen tribute, and Celine understood within the first conversation that paying respects meant something closer to taking measurements. A lord's daughter named Isolde, golden hair, and a single dimple, deep and crooked, only on the left side of her mouth, so her smile always looked slightly unfinished. Sat across from Celine in a parlor and asked her, with that unfinished smile firmly in place, how exactly a scullery girl had managed to catch a king's eye, and whether perhaps Celine had some skill she wasn't aware she possessed. The way she said skill made the meaning of the word turn over in the air like something rotting underneath. "I didn't catch anything," Celine said. "He chose. I didn't ask him to." "No," Isolde agreed, soft as a blade going in clean. "I don't imagine you did. That's almost the worst part, isn't it? If you'd schemed for it, at least it would make sense." Celine held the woman's gaze for exactly as long as her training allowed before lowering her eyes, and Isolde's dimple deepened with something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite pity either. That night, someone left a dead bird on the threshold of Celine's room. No note, no claim. Just a small gray shape with its neck wrong, positioned so she'd have to step over it to leave for breakfast. A message with no fingerprints on it at all. She didn't tell anyone. She wrapped it in a cloth and buried it in the kitchen garden before dawn, handshaking, and told herself this was simply the cost of being chosen by mistake, that the only sane response was to be smaller, quieter, less. Until whatever had made the king point at her wore off and released her back into the safety of being nobody. She was wrong about that, too. But she wouldn't learn why for some time yet. Fen found her 3 days later in the kitchen garden, kneeling in dirt she had no business kneeling in, replanting herbs that had been trampled by some careless boot, hands black to the wrist. He stood at the edge of the bed for a moment before she noticed him. When she did, she startled so hard she nearly fell backward into the rosemary. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" Celine sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time since the auction hall. Really looked, not the quick downward glance of habit, but a full, deliberate study. The kind that felt dangerous and clarifying both at once. He'd traded the road-salted coat for something plainer, sleeves pushed up, and up close the fishhook scar by his jaw looked older than she'd guessed, years old, long-healed but never quite faded. "Because my hands know what to do with dirt," she said. "They don't know what to do with anything else. Here." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, not quite sorrow. He crouched, without being invited to, and pressed a clump of soil back around a bruised stem of thyme with a care that surprised her, given the size of his hands, given everything she'd been told about what those hands were capable of in war. "Has to tell you that you wouldn't last the season," he said. Not a question. Celine's hands went still in the dirt. "How did you?" "She tells everyone that. It's how she decides who's worth her time." He glanced sideways at her. You're still here, for now. For now, he agreed, and something in the simplicity of it. No promise attached, no reassurance offered. Just an honest matching of her own uncertainty, settled in Celine's chest in a way she didn't have a name for yet. They worked in silence after that, side by side in the dirt, and it was the longest stretch of peace Celine had known since before the soldiers came for her family, years ago, in a life that felt, now, like someone else's. Neither of them spoke again until the light started to go gold and low. "Why did you choose me?" she finally said. The question she'd been carrying since the auction hall, asked now low and plain instead of shouted across a frightened room. Fenn's jaw worked once. Twice. "I don't fully know how to answer that yet," he said, and it sounded, for the first time, like the truth costing him something to admit. "When I do, I'll tell you." It wasn't enough. It would have to be enough for now, because it was all he was willing to give. And Celine went to bed that night with two facts sitting uneasily together in her chest. That the king who'd upended her whole life couldn't explain why, and that some part of her had stopped wanting him to take it back. The reversal came on a night. Celine wasn't expecting it. In a room that smelled like beeswax candles and old wine, during a banquet she'd been told to attend and dreaded every hour leading up to. She wore a gown that wasn't hers. In a shade of gray-blue that someone in the household had chosen, she suspected, to be cruel, close enough to her ribbon's color that it felt like mockery, a reminder of the one thing she owned dressed up as a gift. She sat 3 seats down from Fenn at a table crowded with lords and their wives and their daughters with unfinished smiles, and she counted, silently, the number of times someone glanced at her like she was a stain that had wandered too close to clean linen. It was Iseld who finally said it out loud, halfway through the second course, voice pitched just loud enough to carry the length of the table without quite crossing into rudeness anyone could call out by name. "My lord, you must indulge our curiosity eventually." Her dimple deepened. The whole court whispers of nothing else. Out of 41 women raised for exactly this honor, you chose a girl who'd been given nothing to eat in days. Surely there's a story in it. The table went quiet in that particular way Celine was starting to recognize. The quiet of people pretending not to listen while listening with everything they had. Fenns set down his cup. He didn't look angry. He looked, if anything, like a man finally deciding to say a thing he'd been turning over alone for a week. "There is a story," he said. Celine's pulse climbed into her throat. "The morning of the auction," Fenn said, "before any of you arrived, I walked the holding cells where they kept the tribute candidates overnight. Cold stone, no fires lit yet, 41 women who hadn't eaten properly in days because no one feeds livestock they're about to sell. A few of the lords shifted at livestock, recognizing, perhaps, an accusation folded into the word. There was a child in the cell beside Celine's. Not a tribute. A kitchen child, maybe 7 years old, locked in by mistake or by neglect. Nobody's claimed which yet, and I intend to find out." The hall had gone fully silent now. Even the serving staff had stopped moving. Someone had given Celine a single heel of bread that morning, the only food offered to her in 3 days. Fenn's eyes found Celine's down the table, and she felt the whole room narrow to that single point of contact. She broke it in half, gave the larger piece to the child through the bars, kept nothing for herself but the smaller half, and didn't eat that either. Saved it, I learned later, in case the child needed it again before nightfall. Celine's face had gone hot. She hadn't known anyone had seen that. She hadn't done it to be seen. "I watched through a crack in the door for 11 minutes, Fenn said, quieter now, like the rest of the room had fallen away from him too. 11 minutes, and in that time, every other candidate in that cell block either slept, or wept, or begged a guard for more food. Only one girl, starving, chained, with every reason in the world to keep what little she had, gave it away, and didn't look around first to see if anyone was watching her do it." He looked back at the table. at Iseldi's frozen, unfinished smile, at lords who had no answer for this prepared anywhere in their store of court replies. My wolf has chosen mates before tonight that my mind agreed with for sound sensible reasons, Fen said. This was the first time my wolf chose someone my mind couldn't yet explain. It took me a week to understand that the explanation was simply that. A woman with nothing left gave the last of it away, expecting no one to ever know. Silence sat on that hall like a held breath that didn't want to be the one to break first. That's not a story you tell to win an argument with a court, he said. But you asked, so now you have it. He hadn't asked Celine's permission to share it. She understood, sitting there with her face burning and 40 pairs of eyes recalibrating everything they'd assumed about her. That some part of this, the telling, the making public of a private kindness she'd never meant for an audience, had cost her something too. He'd given the court a reason to stop laughing at her. He'd also taken from her the one thing that had been entirely, privately hers. She didn't know, yet, which mattered more. It should have ended the laughter. For a handful of days, it nearly did. The talk in the corridors shifted, just slightly, from mockery to something more careful, more calculating, as though the court were recounting its math now that a new variable had entered the equation. Celine noticed lords nodding to her in halls who hadn't bothered to before. She noticed, too, that nodding wasn't the same as believing. Iseld found her alone. 4 days later, in the same kitchen garden where Fen had once knelt beside her in the dirt, and the woman's unfinished smile had sharpened into something with an edge on it. A pretty story, Iseld said without preamble. Bread and a hungry child. It plays well at a banquet table. She crouched, plucking a sprig of rosemary she had no use for, turning it between her fingers like a woman handling evidence. But you understand it isn't enough, don't you? A king doesn't build a marriage on a single kind moment in a holding cell. Kindness is cheap, Celine. Anyone can be kind once when she thinks no one's watching. I wasn't performing for him. No, Iseldi agreed. Too easily. I don't think you were. That's what makes you dangerous, actually. You didn't even know you were being watched, and it worked anyway. Do you understand how that looks to women who've spent years learning the correct kindness? The kind that's seen, the kind that's strategic? You make our whole education look foolish by accident. Her eyes were bright, and not entirely unkind, in a way that confused Celine more than open cruelty would have. I don't hate you, if that helps. I hate that I can't compete with something I didn't know was a contest. She left without waiting for a response, and Celine knelt alone in the dirt for a long time afterward, turning over a humanizing thing she hadn't expected and didn't fully want. The understanding that her rival's cruelty wasn't bottomless, that beneath the unfinished smile was a woman frightened of being outmatched by a kind of worth she'd never been taught to perform. It didn't make Iseldi safe. It made her something worse, unpredictable. Because frightened people did unpredictable things. The disappointing thing Celine did. She did 3 nights later, and it cost her exactly as much as the bread had once cost her, in reverse. Fen came to her room, knocked, waited, the kind of formality that had become its own small ritual between them, a line he never crossed without invitation, and told her, plainly, that he meant to name her formally as his intended within the week. Not yet a binding. Not yet a mating claim sealed in front of the pack. But a public step, irreversible in the way that court declarations were irreversible. A line drawn that the whole of Ashvale would see and have to respect. I need you to be certain, he said. Once it's said, it can't be quietly taken back. Not without humiliating us both. And Celine, exhausted, frightened, still carrying 7 years of training that said, nothing good lasts. Brace for the moment it's taken away. Did the thing that cost her something real. She lied. I'm certain, she said. She wasn't. Not entirely. Some sleepless, honest corner of her was still waiting for the morning he'd realize his mistake and send her back to a kitchen somewhere. And some other corner, newer, more frightening, had started, against every instinct of self-protection she owned, to want him, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to examine because wanting things had only ever preceded losing them. She told him she was certain because she was terrified that hesitation would read as rejection, and rejection would end the only safety she'd found in years. It was a small lie. It would not stay small. Fen took her hand, the first time he'd done so without the careful 3 feet of distance he usually kept, and turned it over, his thumb finding the crescent-burned scar on her wrist, tracing it once, slow, like he was reading something written there. "Kitchen burn," he said. Not a question. "Oil pan. 5 years ago." Her voice had gone thinner than she meant it to. "Does it still hurt?" "No." Another small lie, because it did, sometimes, in cold weather, and she'd decided years ago that admitting pain to anyone was its own kind of debt she couldn't afford to owe. He didn't push. He pressed his mouth, briefly, to the inside of her wrist instead. Not a claim, not yet. Just a question asked with lips instead of words, and Celine's whole body went still in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Tell me if it's too soon," he murmured against her skin. "I'll wait as long as you need." "It's not too soon," she said, and that part, at least, was finally true. He left before either of them crossed a line they weren't ready to cross, the door closing softly behind him, and Celine sat alone afterward, with her wrist still warm from his mouth, and her conscience uneasy with the lie she'd told him about being certain. A small dishonesty that would surface again, later, at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible audience. The reprisal came 11 days later, in the great hall, dressed up as ceremony. Fen had announced her as his intended exactly as promised, and the announcement should have settled things. Instead, it lit a fuse. A formal claim invited formal challenge. Under Ashvale law older than the keep's stones, any noble house could contest a king's chosen mate on grounds of unsuitability, provided they brought evidence before the full court. 3 families filed the contest within a day of each other, and Celine understood, watching Hesta's face go tight with something that might almost have been worry on her behalf, that someone had been organizing this since the banquet, waiting for exactly this opening. She stood in the center of the great hall, on a morning bright enough to hurt, in a gown of deep blue that was, for once, actually hers, and faced a half-circle of nobility arranged like a jury that had already reached its verdict. Yiseldi's father spoke first, a man with the same unfinished quality to his mouth that his daughter had, though on him it read as something closer to permanent disappointment. "My lord, with respect, the girl has no lineage, no dowry, no claim beyond a kitchen incident witnessed by you alone. We ask the court to consider whether a story, however moving, constitutes sufficient grounds to elevate a servant to the king's side. A second lord, broader, older, a thick white scar bisecting one eyebrow from some old border skirmish, added, and there is the matter of her conduct since arriving. Withdrawn, secretive, hardly the bearing of a woman certain of her place." That last word landed exactly where it was aimed. Certain. Celine felt it strike home and understood, with cold dawning horror, that someone in this hall knew about the lie she'd told Fen in private, or had guessed close enough to it that the guess didn't matter. "She lied to you, my lord," Yiselda said, stepping forward, voice pitched to Carrie, dimple gone entirely now, nothing unfinished about her expression at all. Ask her. Ask her whether she was certain that night you came to her room, or whether she said what she thought you needed to hear because she was afraid of what saying no would cost her. The hall's eyes swung to Celine like a single creature turning its head. She looked at Fen. He was looking back at her, and for the first time since the auction hall, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not doubt, exactly, but the visible effort of a man holding a question he genuinely didn't have the answer to yet. "Is it true?" he asked her, quiet, just for her, though the whole hall strained to hear it anyway. Celine's mouth had gone dry. She could lie again, could compound the first lie with a second one, smooth it over, protect them both from this exposure in front of a court that wanted her gone. 7 years of training screamed at her to do exactly that. "Yes," she said instead, "I lied. I told you I was certain because I was afraid that if I told you the truth, that I was still half waiting for you to change your mind, still bracing for it, the way I've braced for everything good in my life to be taken back. You'd hear that as me saying no, and I couldn't bear that, so I lied instead of trusting you with the truth." The hall didn't gasp this time either. It did the same edged silence it had done in the auction hall, except now Celine wasn't bracing inside it. She was standing inside it, having chosen, finally, to give the truth away with nothing held back, the same way she'd once given away half a heel of bread with no expectation of it ever being returned. Iselda's father pressed the advantage immediately. "There, my lord, a woman who lies to her king within days of his claim. What further evidence does this court require?" Fen was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, it wasn't to the court at all. It was to Celine, and his voice had dropped something formal it had been carrying since the announcement, gone plain and rough at the edges instead. "You were afraid of losing something you'd just been given," he said. "That's not the same as deceiving me about who you are." He turned, finally, to the half-circle of nobles, and his voice hardened back into the register that had once silenced a full auction hall with 2 repeated words. "I chose her because she gave bread to a starving child while starving herself, expecting nothing, watched by no one she knew of. I have watched her since hide in a garden rather than ask for anything she thought she didn't deserve. I have watched her absorb cruelty from this court for 11 days, without retaliation, without complaint, without once asking me to intervene on her behalf." His jaw tightened. "I cannot give you a tidy explanation my wolf chose her, for beyond this, I have ruled beside calculation my whole life, and I have never once seen it produce a person who'd give away her last piece of bread. I am not interested in unmaking the one choice in my reign that wasn't calculation." "Sentiment," Iselda's father spat, "is not governance, my lord." "No," Fen agreed, "but it's the only thing in that auction hall that wasn't for sale. I'd ask this court to consider what it says about the rest of you that you can't recognize the difference." The white-scared lord shifted, uncomfortable, and said nothing further, but Iselda stepped forward one more time, and what she said next was aimed, with precision, not at Fen but at Celine herself. "Pretty speeches," she said. "But speeches aren't binding, my lord, and a contest under Ashvale law requires more than your testimony alone. It requires the girl herself to stand before this court and answer one question honestly, under witness, with no king to speak for her." Her eyes cut to Celine, sharp and bright and finally fully honest about their hostility. "Tell this court, without him answering for you, why you deserve this, not why he chose you, why you believe you've earned a place no one here was prepared to give you. It was a trap built to humiliate." Celine understood that immediately, that there was no answer here that wouldn't sound either arrogant or pathetic, that Iselda had found the one question with no safe shape to it. She answered it anyway, and for the first time in 7 years she didn't lower her eyes while she did it. "I don't think I've earned it," Celine said. "If earning means I did something clever enough to deserve a crown, I didn't. I gave a piece of bread to a child because she was hungry, and I had bread, and there wasn't a version of keeping it that I could have lived with afterward. I'd have done it whether anyone ever found out or not. I'd have done it the night before I died, if that's how it had gone." Her voice didn't shake, though her hands, hidden in her skirts, were trembling badly enough that she had to dig her nails into her own palms to steady them. "I don't know if that's worth a crown. I only know it's the truest thing about me, and it's the only thing I have to offer that nobody gave me, and nobody can take away. If that's not enough for this court, then I'd rather lose with that than win with anything else." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Not cruel, not waiting, just full, the way a held breath is full just before it's finally let go. Fen crossed the distance between them. Not the careful 3 feet he'd kept since the garden, but the full distance, closing it in front of the entire court, and took her trembling hand in both of his, lifting it deliberately, so the half-circle of nobility could see the crescent burned scar on her wrist that she'd spent 5 years hiding. "This court doesn't get to decide what she's earned," he said. "I do, and I've decided." The contest under Ashvale law required a majority of the assembled houses to sustain it. When the white-scared lord was asked to cast his voice, he hesitated, glanced once at the king's face, and withdrew his vassali's claim. 2 others followed within the hour, the contest dissolving the way ice dissolves once one crack finally runs all the way through, slow, then all at once. Only Iseldi's father held out, and even he, 3 days later, sent a formal letter of withdrawal that nobody in the keep ever saw him write personally. The rumor was that his daughter had written it for him in a hand too neat to have been done in anger. Iseldi herself never apologized. She did, on the morning the formal binding was finally announced, send a single sprig of rosemary to Celine's room, with no note attached. The same herb she'd once turned over in her fingers, like evidence in that garden, offered now without explanation, the closest thing to surrender a woman like her had in her. Celine kept it. She didn't fully know why. Maybe because not every ending needed an apology to be an ending. There's a version of this story, the one the court tried to tell, the one Hesta half believed for the first week and was wrong about, where the starving kitchen girl gets noticed by a king, and that's the whole of it. Luck. A crown landing on the right head by accident, the way rain happens to fall on one particular stone. That's not what happened, and if you've come this far with me, you already know it isn't. What happened is harder to put in a single sentence, and maybe that's why the court struggled with it. Why Iselda's father needed a contest and a half-circle of nobles before he could even begin to understand it. A woman with nothing left to give had given anyway, in a cold cell, to a child who wasn't even watching closely enough to remember her face afterward. And a king who'd built his whole life on calculation found, for the first time, something his calculation couldn't reproduce, and refused to let go of it, just because the court demanded a tidier reason. I think about that 11 minutes through a cracked door more than almost anything else in this story. 11 minutes nobody was supposed to witness. That's the part the auction hall never understood, watching him point past 40 prized beauties to a girl in chains. They thought he was choosing strangely. He wasn't choosing strangely at all. He was the only person in that hall who'd already seen the only thing worth choosing. Celine never did get a grand title for what she'd done. There's no ballad about a heel of bread split in half in a cold cell. But she got something the court couldn't take a vote on and couldn't dissolve with a contest. A man who held her trembling hand up in front of every noble who'd doubted her and said, plainly, "I've decided," and meant it not because his wolf had chosen her, but because he had every day since chosen her again. That's the part I keep coming back to, if I'm honest with you. Not the auction, not the chains, or the gasp the hall never quite let itself make. The part where a girl who'd been taught for 7 years that nothing good was ever hers to keep, stood in front of people who wanted her gone, and told the truth instead of the safe lie, and found out, finally far too late to believe it easily, that the truth was the thing that had been enough all along. She still has the ribbon, gray-blue, frayed at both ends. She wears it less now, but she's never once thrown it away. And somewhere in Ashvale, on cold mornings, you can still find rosemary growing wild in a garden bed that no one quite remembers planting, except, if you ask her, she'll tell you. She remembers exactly whose hands put it there, and exactly who knelt beside her in the dirt and stayed.